The first freeze came early that October, before the harvest was in, and it killed the beans outright. Martha Crane stood at the edge of her garden with a burlap sack half full of shriveled pods and watched the frost wilt the last green hope she had left. The leaves blackened where she stood, curling along the stalks, and the pods beneath them were soft and useless. She had counted on those beans to settle her account at the mercantile. She had counted on them to get her through winter, and now they hung limp and ruined, and she had nothing to put in their place. She was 34 years old, 2 years widowed, and the only woman farming 160 acres in Douglas County. Her land lay 3 miles west of Clinton, a low stretch of broken bluestem prairie that her husband's people had plowed to exhaustion 40 years earlier. The soil that had once grown corn belly-high to a man was now pale and crusted, stubborn as clay baked in a kiln. Every season she put in seed, and every season the ground gave back less. The neighbors said the place was played out. They said it behind their hands and sometimes to her face, as if the land's failure were a judgment on her alone. She kept 2 cows, a dozen hens, a sow named Biddy, and a vegetable garden that had never, in all her running of it, yielded enough to feed her past November. She sold butter and eggs at Withers Dry Goods in town, and every week the till of coins in the kitchen drawer grew thinner. She had not bought a new dress in 3 years. She had not laughed in longer than she could remember. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the women who held families together with nothing but will and a skillet, the farmers who turned mockery into miracle, the quiet ones who kept on when everyone else told them to stop. This is the story of Martha Crane, who bought 180 baby chicks on a spring morning and changed everything she knew. Picture her there in that October cold, a thin woman in a patched apron, her hands red and chapped, the dead beans spilling from her sack. The wind off the prairie keened through the gaps in the barn boards. Inside the house, the stove had been lit only twice that week because wood was dear, and she could not spare a nickel for a cord. She had a roof that leaked in 3 places, a well that ran to mud in July, and a mortgage held by the First Bank in Lawrence that she had not been able to pay since her husband passed. She was sinking, and she knew it, and the knowing sat in her like a stone that would not dissolve. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets, and stay by the fire a little longer. That evening she sat at her kitchen table with a stub of candle and a letter from the bank. It was brief and polite, as such things are. It informed her that the note would come due in May, and if it could not be met, the property would be put up for auction. She read it twice, then folded it into the cracks in the table where she kept such things. She did not cry. The tears had dried up sometime in the 2nd year of this fight. She simply sat, and the candle burned low, and the wind outside tried the window frame like a hand looking for a way in. In the morning she walked the garden one more time, the frost still white on the dead vines, and she asked herself the question she had asked every morning for 2 years. What am I going to do? The answer came from down the creek. Ellis Payne was 73 years old, bent as a cottonwood in a flood, and hard of hearing to the point that he shouted everything he said. He had farmed his own quarter section for 50 years, lost his wife to a fever, and buried 3 daughters before they reached the age of 10. The town counted him simple because he did not talk much and because he gave away half of what he grew to neighbors who were down on their luck. But Ellis Payne knew 2 things that no one in town gave him credit for. He could read the land better than any man in Douglas County, and he understood the worth of what others threw away. He came up the lane that morning with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that Martha recognized, the look he got when he had found something strange and wanted her to come see. "Got a proposition for you, Martha," he shouted before he was 20 feet from the porch. "Hatchery in Lawrence has a mess of chicks, 180 of them. Buyer backed out. Railroad lost the order. Man says he'll give 'em away just to clear the place." Martha stared at him. "What would I do with 180 chickens?" "Feed 'em," he shouted, "and let 'em feed you back. Chickens scratch, Martha. They eat bugs, they eat weeds. And the droppings, the best soil dressing God ever made. You work that flock over your garden beds, and you won't need guano or anything else." It sounded absurd. She said so. But Ellis Payne had never led her wrong in the years since her husband died. He had shown her how to cut corn mush with acorn flour when the grist mill closed. He had taught her to tell a hen that was laying by the color of her comb. He was patient and unhurried, and when she spoke of her worries, he listened, really listened, without telling her she ought to sell and move to town like everyone else. She let the idea sit for a day. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and watched the window gray toward dawn and thought about the 180 mouths she would have to feed, and the cost of feed, and the coop she did not have, and the fencing that was rotten at the posts. She thought about what the town would say. They were already whispering about the widow crane who could not manage her land. This would give them a new thing to laugh at. But she also thought about the garden, the dead beans, the cracked soil, the banknote in the table crack. "Nothing's worthless," her mother had always said. "There's only folks who haven't learned to see what's right in front of them." She rode into Lawrence the next morning, borrowed wagon and all. The hatchery sat behind the depot, a long, low building loud with peeping. The owner, a bald man with a forehead like a frying pan, led her through the door and gestured at the crates. Chicks spilled everywhere, a yellow flood of them, each one no bigger than a walnut. The noise filled the room, and the smell was considerable, straw and droppings and the heat of small bodies. "Take the lot," the man said. "I'll sell for the cost of the crates. Feeds included. Otherwise, I'm out the price of keeping them another week." Martha did the arithmetic in her head. Even at that price, it was a gamble. She had $23 in the kitchen drawer. She needed every cent for seed in the spring. If the chicks died, she would have nothing. No garden, no money, no way to meet the note. The neighbors would shake their heads and say they had known all along. She stood in the doorway for a long minute. The man waited, used to letting a thing sell itself. She thought of her mother's voice. She thought of Ellis Payne's certainty. She thought of the garden, gray and dead, and the banknote that would come due whether she was ready or not. "I'll take them," she said. The loading took an hour. The crates were stacked in the wagon bed, tied down with rope, and the peeping rose so loud that the horses kept flicking their ears and shifting their feet. Martha drove home through the April wind, holding the reins in one hand and clutching the seat with the other, wondering what on earth she had done. Ellis was waiting at the gate. When he saw the wagon, he laughed so hard he had to sit down on the mounting block. "You went and did it," he said, wiping his eyes. "I went and did it." Her voice shook between terror and a thrill she had not felt in 3 years. They carried the crates into the lean-to off the barn, where it was warm and out of the wind. The chicks poured out across the straw, a yellow flood, and for a moment Martha just watched them, letting herself hope. They were so small, so fragile, so utterly dependent on her. She had 180 lives now, and every one of them was her responsibility. Ellis practically moved in that first week. He showed her how to keep a low fire under the brooders, not too hot, not too cold, how to dip each beak in water so they learned to drink. He had a patience that 50 years of farming had only deepened, and watching him cup a struggling chick in his weathered hands, she understood why the town's dismissal of him had always angered her. He read living things the way other men read books, and under his quiet instruction she began to learn the same. The first problem was simple and enormous. 180 chickens left to roam would strip her dooryard bare in a week and foul every step she took. Penned in one place, they would turn that patch to mud and waste everything they produced on ground she was not even trying to grow in. She sat at her kitchen table with a stub of pencil and the back of a feed sack and tried to think her way through it. It was the garden beds that gave her the idea. They needed exactly what the birds made, the scratching, the bugs eaten, the droppings worked in. What if instead of bringing the leavings to the garden, she brought the birds to the beds? Not loose, where they would scratch up her seed, but penned in something she could move. A coop with no floor. A coop on wheels. She took the notion to Ellis, half expecting him to laugh again. Instead, he went quiet the way he did when something caught him, and then he nodded slowly. "Move 'em across a bed," he said. "Let 'em work it. Roll 'em onto the next when the first one's done. That's—" He paused, searching. "That's clever, Martha. That's real clever." They built the first one out of scrap. The barn yielded old boards. A busted hay rake gave up its wheels, and Ellis's shed surrendered a coil of wire that had been waiting 40 years for a purpose. The thing they made was ugly as sin. A long, low box, open at the bottom, screened on the sides, with a peaked top to shed rain, and a little hinged door at one end. 2 wheels at the back and 2 handles at the front, so a person could lift like a wheelbarrow and roll it along. She put 20 birds in it the first day, the largest of the now half-grown lot, and set it over the worst of her dead beds. Then she stood back to watch. The birds did not know they had a job. They knew only that the ground beneath them was new and full of interest. They fell to scratching at once, kicking the packed gray crust loose, snapping up the bugs and cutworms that had been quietly eating her garden for 3 seasons. They pecked the weed seedlings down to nubs. They dusted themselves in the loosened dirt and made a tremendous fuss. And everywhere they walked, they left the droppings that Ellis swore by. By evening, the patch beneath the coop, which that morning had been hard, pale crust, was tilled to a soft, dark crumble, dotted and worked through with their leavings. Martha knelt and pushed her fingers into it. It gave. For the first time in 3 years, the ground gave. She rolled the coop forward 6 feet onto the next stretch of bed, and did it again the next day, and the next. The birds ate the bugs, ate the weeds, scratched and dusted, and unwittingly tilled and fed every foot of ground they passed over. She learned to read when a patch was done, when the weeds were gone and the surface worked soft, and to move them before they overdid it and packed it down again. Timing was everything. Too long in one place, and they wasted the very ground they had improved. Just right, and they left it better than any spade could. 1 coop became 2. She built the second faster than the first, and the third faster than the second, her hands learning the work. She split the flock among them and ran them in a line down the long beds, leapfrogging one ahead of another, so that the garden was always being worked somewhere. Mornings, she rolled them forward, scattered a little bruised grain, freshened their water. Evenings, she shut the little doors against the foxes in the dark. The kitchen scraps that she had always thrown to the pigs now went to the birds too. Pea pods, carrot tops, the trimmings and peelings she had never thought twice about. They fell on it all like it was Christmas dinner and turned it, by some patient alchemy, into more of the dark, rich crumble that was spreading down her beds like a tide coming in. Ellis came every day, and they worked side by side, 2 figures bent over rolling coops in a field. The sight must have been comical from the road, but Martha had stopped caring how it looked. Under her hands the dead ground was waking. She could smell it, that deep, sweet, mineral smell of soil that means to grow something. She had nearly forgotten it. Now she breathed it in every morning, and it was the smell of hope. Word got around. The first to come look was Orrin Hiller, the son of the man who owned the dry goods store. He stopped his horse at the fence and gawked at the rolling coops until Martha waved, and he reined around and rode off. By Sunday, the whole town seemed to have heard that the widow Crane was pushing chicken houses around her garden on wagon wheels, and the town found this very funny indeed. They came by the road to see it, slowing their buggies, some honest enough to laugh out loud, others doing it behind their hands. Ezra Draper, who owned the banknote, drove out on a Tuesday, reined up grandly, and looked over the fence with the expression of a man enjoying a show he had predicted. "Mrs. Crane," he called. "I'd heard, but I had to see. You've gone and built yourself a chicken parade." "Good afternoon, Mr. Draper. You know what you've bought, don't you? Noise and feathers and droppings. 180 mouths eating you out of house and home." He shook his head with great satisfaction. "I'll tell you the same as before. You can't make that ground pay. No shame in admitting it." Martha leaned on her coop handle and considered him. She thought of the banknote, due in May. She thought of the thin garden she was leaving behind and the dark, crumbled soil beneath the birds. She thought of Ellis's certainty and her mother's voice. She lifted the coop and rolled it forward 6 feet. The birds clucked and tumbled, and she turned her back to scatter their grain. Ezra Draper watched a moment longer, then pulled his horse's head around and drove off without another word. But he did not laugh. And Martha knew that the laughter had changed into something else, a curiosity that could be dangerous, or could be her salvation. She worked on, and the garden spread green behind her. The early beds, planted first, were already racing ahead of anything she had grown in years. The vines reached and twined. The squash set blossoms and then fruit, small green knobs swelling visibly week to week. The potato plants bushed out so full and dark she could not see the ground between the hills. She kept records now, the way Ellis had taught her, which bed the birds had worked, and for how long, when she had planted behind them, how each row was coming. She filled the back of an old ledger with her cramped figures and her sketches of the coops, refining the design as she went. The fourth coop she built had a better roof. The fifth had a clever sliding panel that let her move the birds to fresh ground without ever lifting them out. The flock thrived, too, fat and glossy on bugs and weeds and scraps. As summer wore on, the pullets began to lay eggs, more eggs than she had ever gathered, more than she could eat or sell at Wither's Dry Goods. She traded them down the road and gave them away, and still there were eggs. There were hard mornings. A storm one night tipped a coop, and she lost 3 birds to the weather, spending a wet dawn chasing the rest through the corn. A weasel got into the run before she had learned to shut the doors tight, and that was a grief she did not dwell on. But the work had its own deep rhythm now, and she rose each day glad to meet it. She was thinner and browner, and her hands were rough as bark, and she had not felt so well in years. In the long evenings, she and Ellis sat on the porch step and watched the swallows turn over the garden. The garden below them was no longer gray. It was green and growing and getting greener, and the smell of it came up sweet on the cool air. The turn came on a July afternoon when she dug, out of pure curiosity, into one of the earliest potato hills. She only meant to check how they were setting. She loosened the soil with her fingers and brought up a potato, then another, then a whole nest of them, 6, 8, 10 to the single hill, smooth and heavy and bigger than any she had grown in the best years before her husband died. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and laughed out loud, alone in her garden, holding potatoes in both hands like a child holding treasure. It was working. Not might work, not seemed to be working. It was working, and the proof was warm and solid in her palms. She was going to make it. But success has a way of drawing the wrong kind of attention, and Martha's good fortune did not go unnoticed at the bank in Lawrence. Ezra Draper had built his standing in the township on a simple thing. He knew best. He held the notes on half the farms in the county. His word on a matter of farming was as good as law, and nobody had ever profited by crossing it. The sight of the widow Crane making her dead ground bloom with chicken houses and scraps was to him not a curiosity, it was a threat. If a woman with no money and no man could make a tired farm pay by ignoring everything he sold and everything he advised, then what exactly was Ezra Draper's word worth? He stopped driving past to laugh. He started driving past to look, really look, the way Ellis looked, though it pained him to do it. And what he saw down those long beds, where his own bottomland was already going yellow in the July heat, was a garden greener than any field in the township. He began to talk, not loudly at first. He mentioned to men leaning on his counter at the dry goods store that he was not sure the Crane place was being kept clean. All those birds, all those droppings worked right into the dirt where she meant to grow food a body would eat. Wasn't sanitary, wasn't safe. He had heard, he said, and here he would drop his voice, that sickness came off filth like that. He did not like to say it about a widow, but a man had a duty to his neighbors. The talk spread the way his talk always did, because he was Ezra Draper, and he knew best. The women who had pressed Martha's hand at church now pressed it more gently still, and asked, with real worry now, whether it was wise, all those chickens so near where she grew her supper. The dry goods owner, who had taken her extra eggs all summer, grew cool about it, and mentioned he had had a customer ask whether the Crane eggs were wholesome. Martha felt the change like a draft under a door. The laughter had been bad. This was worse. Laughter you could turn your back on, but a whisper that your food might make people sick, that could ruin her surer than any failed crop, because it did not matter how heavy her beans hung if nobody in the county would buy or eat them. Then Draper made it official. He was, among his other dignities, a member of the County Agricultural Society. the body that ran the autumn fair and judged its entries. Word came down, carried by a sympathetic neighbor woman who did not like the smell of it, that questions were being raised about whether produce grown in such conditions ought to be allowed to compete at all. For the health of the public, there was talk of an inspection. There was talk of barring the crane entries. Martha understood at once what that meant. The fair was where reputations were made. A blue ribbon at the Douglas County Fair was worth more than the prize money. It was the town's verdict, spoken in public, on whose ground was good and whose was not. If she could stand at that table in the fall, with the heaviest, finest produce in the county, the whispering would die in an afternoon, because folks believed their own eyes over any man's gossip. Draper knew it too. That was exactly why he meant to keep her out. She went to Ellis nearly sick with it. He listened, his face going hard in a way she had rarely seen, and when she finished, he was quiet a long time. "He can't say your food's poison," Ellis said at last, "not without proof." Folks will listen to a whisper, but a whisper's all it is. You put it to the test in the open, where they can't pretend not to see, and the whisper's got nothing left to stand on. He looked at her. But you got to be willing to put it to the test in front of all of them, and risk losing in front of all of them too. Martha spent 2 days turning it over. The safe thing was to keep her head down, sell quiet, eat well through the winter, and let the fair pass without her. Her debt at the dry goods store she could likely meet now regardless. The garden was that good. She did not need the ribbon. She did not need to stand up in front of the whole county and dare Ezra Draper to call her a liar to her face. But she thought about the whisper, and how a whisper did not stop. It would follow her into next year and the year after. It would sit on her eggs and her produce like a stain. And it would teach every other struggling farmer in the township the same lesson Draper wanted taught, that you did things his way, bought his seed, took his advice, or you got whispered out of business. She thought about her mother. Nothing's worthless. There's only folks who haven't learned to see. She went to town and asked to be heard at the Agricultural Society's next meeting. They gave her 10 minutes in a hot back room full of men who mostly owed Ezra Draper money. Draper sat among them, broad and easy, certain of his ground. Martha stood with her ledger held against her like a shield, and her heart going hard, and she made them an offer instead of a plea. She did not ask to be let in. She challenged them. She said she had heard her produce called unfit, and she would not have it said behind her back. Let them come to her farm, all of them, anyone who cared to, and inspect it top to bottom before the fair. Let them see the birds, the coops, the beds, the records she had kept. Let them dig her potatoes themselves and weigh them against any plot in the county. And let them enter her produce at the fair on its merits, like anyone else's, and judge it blind, not knowing whose it was, so no man could say she had won on anything but the food itself. The room was quiet. It was a fair offer, and fair offers are hard to refuse in front of witnesses. To say no was to admit they only meant to keep her out. Draper saw the trap closing and tried to talk his way clear. He spoke of public health, of duty, of the dangers a man of experience could foresee that a well-meaning widow could not. He was smooth, and he was practiced, and he had won 100 counterside arguments this way. But Ellis Payne had come to the meeting too, sitting in the back where folks always seated him to forget him. And now the old man stood, and because he was half deaf, he spoke too loud, and the loudness filled the room and stopped Draper cold. "I farmed this county 50 years, Ellis boomed. Buried my wife, buried my daughters, and I'm telling you that what that woman's done out there is the soundest farming I ever saw. Older than seed catalogs, older than this county. Folks have known forever that beasts feed the ground that feeds them. She just had the wit to do it where everybody could watch. There's nothing dirty in it. There's nothing dangerous in it. The only thing dangerous to anybody in this room," and here he looked square at Draper, "is that she did it cheaper and better than the man who sells you your seed." Nobody had heard Ellis Payne make a speech in 20 years. The novelty alone held them. The sense of it held them longer. The society voted, with Draper's own customers watching one another's faces, to accept Martha's offer in full. The inspection would happen. The judging would be blind. Her entries would stand or fall on the food. Martha walked out into the autumn dusk with her ledger under her arm, and her knees shaking, and Ellis beside her, both of them too wrung out to speak. She had what she wanted. Now she only had to be right, and to be right in front of everyone, with no place left to hide if the ground let her down. The inspection was set for a Saturday. On the Thursday night before it, the wind came up out of the southwest, hot and dry, and Martha woke near midnight to a sound that turned her cold. The high, panicked clamor of the whole flock at once. She ran out in her nightclothes with a lantern and found one of the coops overturned and broken open, the wire torn loose, and birds scattered shrieking into the dark. The latches she had shut were thrown. Bootprints, not paws, pressed deep in the soft, worked soil around the wreckage. Someone had come in the night. And down at the far end, where her finest, heaviest, most perfect potato hills stood ready to be dug and weighed, the plants lay trampled flat into the dirt. She did not cry. She sat down right there in the cold, ruined dirt with the lantern beside her, and felt something worse than crying, a hollow, scooped-out certainty that she had been a fool to fight at all. The inspection was 2 days off. Half her best hills were crushed, and she had no way to prove who had done it. Bootprints in the dark were not evidence. They were just her word against a man whose word was law in this township. She thought about quitting. The thought came in clear and reasonable. She could meet the inspectors at the gate and tell them she had withdrawn her entries. She could sell her birds, pay her account, keep her head down, and be the cautionary tale instead of the fool who fought and lost in public. It would be easier. It would be so much easier. The lantern guttered. Somewhere in the dark, a lost hen called, and another answered. 2 of them, at least, still out there in the night, still alive, still hers. Martha listened to them calling to each other, and slowly, stiffly, got to her feet. Because the answer had been there the whole time, in the calling of those 2 birds in the dark, and she had been too gutted to hear it. She did not need the showpiece hills. She did not need to win on the few perfect potatoes some coward had trampled. She had told the society to dig her ground themselves and weigh it against any plot in the county. And the whole garden was like that, every bed. The birds had worked all of it. He could trample 1 corner, but he could not trample an acre. The proof wasn't in the part he had wrecked. The proof was in the part he couldn't reach. She woke before dawn on the day of the inspection. The wind had died overnight, and the morning came in gray and still, the kind of sky that could go either way. Martha stood at the window with a cup of cold coffee and looked out at the garden. The trampled hills lay dark and broken at the far end, a wound she could not hide. But the rest of it, the long rows of beans, the squash vines thick with fruit, the potato tops still green and heavy, stretched out in a green tide that made her breath catch. She had done that. The birds had done it with her. And no amount of bootprints in the dark could undo what the ground had become. Ellis arrived before the sun cleared the barn roof. He did not mention the vandalism. He simply walked the beds with her, pointing out where the soil had crusted overnight from the wind, where the birds had scratched too deep in 1 corner and needed moving. It was ordinary work, the work of every day, and it steadied her hands. They did not have to wait long. The procession came up the lane at 9 o'clock sharp. 6 members of the Agricultural Society in their Sunday coats, the dry goods owner from Lawrence, the county officer, a woman named Ruth Bledsoe who had carried the warning about the whispers, and, at the front of them, Ezra Draper riding tall and easy on a bay mare. Behind them trailed a dozen buggies and wagons full of folks who had heard there would be something to see. The whole township had turned out for the widow's reckoning. Martha met them at the gate with her ledger and a clean spade. She had put on her best dress, the one with the mended collar, and she had pinned her hair up tight. She stood straight and kept her face still. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said. "You're welcome to all of it. The birds are in their coops. The records are here for any who want them. And the ground is the ground. Dig wherever you like." Ezra Draper dismounted slowly, brushing dust from his trousers. He had a way of looking at a person that made them feel smaller, and he used it now. "We'll do that, Mrs. Crane. We'll dig wherever we like." He turned to the society members and made a small gesture, as if inviting them to a show. "Shall we begin?" They started at the near end, where the first moving coop had worked the ground back in May. Ruth Bledsoe took the spade first, driving it into the soil with a grunt. The blade sank deep, deeper than any of them expected, and when she turned it over, the dirt fell away in a black, crumbly mass shot through with worms. A murmur went through the crowd. Ruth dug out a potato hill, and the potatoes came up in a cluster, smooth and heavy, the size of her fist. She held one up, turning it in the light, and said nothing. She did not need to. They moved to the next bed. The officer took notes. The beans hung thick as a man's finger, and the squash had set fruit so big the vines seemed to strain under the weight. Every hill they dug, every row they examined, returned the same answer. The ground was rich, the produce was sound, and the widow Crane had done something no one in the county had thought possible. Draper followed behind them, his face growing tighter with each discovery. He made a few comments about the smell of the birds, about the droppings that were plainly visible in the worked soil, but his voice had lost its edge. The crowd was no longer paying him attention. They were watching the spade come up, again and again, full of potatoes that shamed any they had grown on their own places. The officer set up a scale on the tailgate of a wagon. They weighed the potatoes from a single hill, 11 pounds, 4 ounces. They weighed beans from a single plant, 3 pounds, 2 ounces. The numbers climbed, and the murmur of the crowd warmed and turned. The faces that had come to see a failure began to shift, the set of the jaw loosening, the eyes widening. They were believing what they saw. It was Draper who made the mistake. He had been watching the far end of the garden, where the trampled hills lay obvious and ugly, and he could not keep from using them. He pointed, his voice too loud. "And what's that then? Down there? Looks to me like the widow's miracle garden's not so hardy after all. Looks to me like half of it's gone and failed. Funny she walked us past that part, isn't it? You see how the scheme falls apart. You can't grow sound food on filth. And there's your proof, flat in the dirt." He had said it in front of everyone. That was what Martha had waited for. She walked down to the trampled beds, and the whole crowd followed. She knelt at the edge of the crushed hills, where the boot prints still pressed deep and plain in the soft, worked soil. The prints were fresh, sharp-edged, unmistakably recent. "It didn't fail, Mr. Draper," she said. She did not raise her voice, so that everyone leaned in to hear her over the wind. "Look here. The plants are torn up by the root. Crops don't tear themselves up. And look at the ground." She set her own foot beside one of the prints, her small, bare track next to a deep, wide boot heel. "Those aren't my prints. They're not animal. Somebody came in the night, 2 nights back, and threw the latches and broke my coop and trampled my best hills flat. Right before the inspection. Right where it would show." The silence was complete. The officer crouched to look at the prints. He was a thorough man, and he set his own boot in the dirt to compare, and then, without being asked, he looked at the boots on the feet of the men standing around the bed. A slow, deliberate look that traveled the circle and came to rest, last of all, on Ezra Draper's fine, wide boots, caked still with a soil darker and richer than anything that grew on Draper's own dry land. Draper followed the look down to his own feet. The color went out of his face. He had not been clever. A man so certain of his standing had not thought to clean his boots, because a man like that never imagines being looked at. The dark, crumbling soil of Martha Crane's workbeds was packed in his heels. The same soil flung up around the trampled hills. A soil that grew nowhere else in the township, because no one else in the township had thought to make it. Nobody had to say a word. The crowd saw it. The officer saw it. The members of the society saw it, and saw, too, the boots of their own neighbors standing clean beside Draper's fouled ones. They understood, in one slow, turning moment, exactly who had crept onto a widow's farm in the dark, and why. Draper opened his mouth and shut it. There was nothing in it to say. He turned and went to his horse through a crowd that drew back from him without a word. That was worse than any shouting. He mounted and rode off, and the township let him go. The officer dusted his hands and looked at Martha. "Mrs. Crane, I believe the society has seen enough. Your entries will be accepted at the fair, blind judged, as you requested, and I'll be filing a report on this vandalism." Martha nodded. She could not speak. The shaking had started in her knees, and she was afraid if she opened her mouth, the tears would come. Ruth Bledsoe came over and put a hand on her arm. "That took something, Martha. That took something." The crowd broke up slowly. Some of the men came forward to shake her hand. Neighbors who had laughed at the rolling coups in June, now asking quietly how the system worked. She answered as best she could, her voice still thin, and Ellis stood beside her, answering the shouted questions because she could not make herself heard. By the time the last buggy pulled away, the sun was high and the garden lay quiet, and Martha sat down on the porch step and put her head in her hands. "I was right," she said to Ellis. "I was right, and he knew it." "You were right," Ellis said, "and now the whole county knows it. All that's left is the fair." The fair was the next week. She spent the days between harvesting what she had chosen for her entries, the finest potatoes, the longest beans, the biggest squash, and packing them carefully in crates lined with clean straw. She cleaned every speck of dirt from the potatoes and trimmed the beans to even lengths. The squash she polished with a cloth until they gleamed. She did not want a single judge to find a flaw that could be blamed on carelessness. She did not see Ezra Draper again before the fair. Word had spread, though. The boot prints had done their own work. At the dry goods store, the owner, who had gone cool over her eggs, now greeted her warmly and asked if she needed any special supplies for the judging. She bought a yard of blue ribbon to pin on her dress as a kind of private joke, and walked out feeling lighter than she had in months. The morning of the fair came in cold and bright, the first true autumn day. Martha loaded her crates onto the wagon, hitched the mare, and drove the 7 miles to Lawrence with Ellis beside her. They did not talk much. The road was rutted, and the wagon creaked, and the crates shifted and clinked. But when they topped the last rise and saw the fairground spread out below, the tents and the pens, the flags and the crowds, the long exhibit hall where the judging would take place, Martha felt a knot tighten in her chest. This was the moment. All the work, all the whispers, all the long nights in the trampled hills, it came down to this one day. They carried her entries into the hall and set them on the numbered tables. The judge, a man from Leavenworth with gold-rimmed spectacles and a suit that had seen better days, walked the rows slowly, making notes in a leather book. He did not know whose produce he was looking at. The entries were numbered, the names sealed, as she had asked. She watched him pause at her potatoes, pick one up, turn it over, set it down. He did not react. He moved on. The waiting was worse than anything. The judging took 3 hours. Martha walked the midway with Ellis, bought a cup of hot cider, looked at the prize cattle and the quilt entries. She did not see Draper anywhere, but she felt the eyes of the crowd on her, curious, waiting, wondering if the widow who had made a spectacle of herself would make a spectacle of herself again, one way or another. At noon, the exhibit hall doors opened, and the crowd pressed in. The results were posted on a chalkboard near the entrance. Martha could not see over the shoulders of the men in front of her. She stood on her toes, craning her neck, and then Ellis cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "First place, potatoes, number 17." 17 was her number. She knew it by heart. "First place, beans, number 17." The crowd parted. Someone pushed her forward. She stood in front of the chalkboard, reading the words herself, because she could not believe what she had heard. Number 17 had taken first in potatoes, first in beans, first in squash. 3 blue ribbons. The judge came over, holding the basket of potatoes she had entered. "Mrs. Crane, I assume?" He had a kind face. "I've judged this fair for 11 years, and I can tell you, these are the finest potatoes I've seen entered. The soil they came from must be something special." Martha opened her mouth to explain about the chickens, but the words would not come. She just nodded, and the judge shook her hand, and then Ruth Bledsoe was there, and the dry goods owner, and a dozen neighbors, all pressing in to see the ribbons and touch the potatoes and ask how she had done it. The questions came fast. How many birds? How long did it take? Could they see the coops? Would she show them how to build one? She answered as best she could, but her mind was elsewhere. Ezra Draper stood at the back of the hall, alone. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at the chalkboard, at the 3 first-place entries all bearing the same number, and the expression on his face was not anger. It was something worse. It was the dawning realization that he had been wrong, publicly wrong, and that the whole county now knew it. Martha met his eyes across the room. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and turned back to the people who were waiting to learn. The afternoon passed in a blur of congratulations and questions. By the time she and Ellis drove home, the wagon was heavier with crates of produce she had sold at premium prices to buyers who had seen the ribbons and wanted the best. The blue ribbons were pinned to her dress, 3 of them, catching the late light as the mare plodded home. She was still wearing them when she walked into her kitchen and sat down at the table. The banknote was due in May. She had enough cash now to cover it, and enough left over for seed and feed and a new roof. The candle stub had burned out weeks ago, but she lit a new one and let it burn. Across the lane, a lantern glowed in the window of Ezra Draper's house. She wondered what he was thinking, and whether the whispers would ever stop. Then she thought about the garden and the birds, and the ground that had given back everything she had put into it. The whispers did not matter. The ground did, and the ground was hers. Winter passed quietly. Martha spent the cold months mending coops, splitting wood, and reading the seed catalogs that arrived with the January thaw. She had money now, not much, but enough to buy good seed and a new set of harness for the mare. The roof held through the February storms, and the kitchen drawer held coins that did not have to be counted twice. The blue ribbons hung on the wall above the stove. She looked at them every morning while she made coffee, and every morning she felt the same small shock of wonder. She had done it. She had won. But the wonder faded as the days grew longer, replaced by a quieter, steadier sense of purpose. The ribbons were not the end. They were the beginning. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the frost was out of the ground, and Martha walked the beds with Ellis, planning the season's work. The flock had grown through the winter, not in number, but in size and strength. The pullets were now full hens, laying steadily through the cold months, and the roosters crowed from the barn roof each dawn. She had 178 birds left, 2 having been lost to the weasel and the storm, and every one of them was glossy and fat. She built 2 more coops over the winter, improving the design. The new ones had hinged roofs for easy cleaning and taller wheels that rolled better over rough ground. She painted them white, not for vanity, but because the paint sealed the wood, and the white reflected the summer heat. Ellis shook his head when he saw the first one finished. "Getting fancy," he said. "Getting practical," she replied. "Paint lasts longer than bare boards. You taught me that." He had. He had taught her 100 things, and she wrote them all down in the ledger now. The timing of the moon for planting, the way to tell a healthy egg from a thin one, the trick of setting a coop on fresh ground just before a rain. She had become the student she had never known she could be, and the ground was her teacher. The neighbors started coming by in April. Not to laugh, those days were over, but to ask. Orrin Hiller came first, the dry goods owner's son, with a notebook and a pencil and a list of questions. He wanted to know how many birds she kept, how much feed they ate, how long it took to work a bed. She showed him the coops, walked him through the rotation, let him dig his fingers into the soil. He wrote everything down, thanked her, and left. Others followed. A young farmer named Tully Baines, whose father had lost his bottomland to the bank, came twice, the second time with his wife. They stood at the edge of her garden and watched the birds scratch and dust, and Martha saw something in their faces that she recognized. The same hunger she had felt 2 years before, the desperate hope that there might be a way through. She gave them the old coop from the first batch. It was worn and crooked, but it worked. She showed them how to build a second, and Tully Baines shook her hand with both of his and said he would never forget it. The spring planting went faster than any she had done. The beds that had been worked by the birds the previous fall were dark and soft, ready for seed. She put in beans and squash and potatoes, corn in the far field, and a patch of pumpkins that she planned to sell at the October market. The seeds went in on a warm April morning, with a light breeze from the south, and within a week the first green shoots were pushing through. She was not the only one planting. All over Douglas County, farmers were putting in their crops with the same hope she had once felt, the hope that this year would be better. But the signs were not good. The winter had been dry, and the spring rains came late and light. By May, the creeks were running low, and the topsoil on the high ground had begun to crack. Ellis noticed it first. He came up the lane one evening with his hat pulled low against the wind and pointed at the sky. "Dust coming up from Kansas," he said. "That's never good. Means the ground's dry down there already, and it'll be dry here soon enough." "What do we do?" she asked. "We keep working the way we've been working. The birds'll hold moisture in the soil better than any plow. That crumble holds water. But we might need to dig the well deeper before summer's out." She had the well cleaned the next week, and she set barrels under the eaves to catch every drop of rain that fell. The rain came, but not enough. June arrived, hot and still, the kind of heat that pressed down like a hand, and the corn in the fields began to curl at the edges. Up and down the road, the other farms started showing the strain. The Baines place, where she had given the old coop, was holding better than most. The worked ground retained moisture where the plowed ground lost it, but the corn on the high ground was stunted and pale. Ezra Draper's fields, which he had planted with the same seed and the same methods he had used for 30 years, were yellowing faster than any. Martha watched from her lane and said nothing. The garden looked good. The beans were climbing the poles, the squash blossoms set, the potato tops thick and dark. The birds moved across the beds in their white coops, scratching and dusting, and the soil beneath them stayed cool and damp long after the surrounding fields had dried to dust. It was in July that the first reports came of grasshoppers hatching on the prairie south of the Kansas River. Farmers coming in from the settlements brought news of clouds of them, moving north, eating everything in their path. The talk at the dry goods store turned grim. Men stood in groups and shook their heads, remembering the outbreak of '74 that had stripped whole counties bare. Martha heard it from Orrin Hiller, who had ridden out to warn her. "They're coming," he said. "Maybe a week, maybe less. They'll hit the county line by Thursday." She looked at her garden, green and full and heavy with fruit, and felt the old cold fear creep back. "What do I do?" "Nothing you can do. They'll eat everything. They always do." He left her standing at the gate, and she watched him ride away, and the wind was hot and dry and carried the faint scent of dust from the south. Ellis came that evening. He sat on the porch step with her, not talking, just being there. The sun went down red through the haze, and the birds settled in their coops with the quiet clucking that had become the sound of her evenings. "They say locusts don't eat chicken scratchings," Ellis said at last. "Who says that?" "Nobody, but I'm saying it. Your birds eat bugs. Grasshoppers are bugs. 178 birds can eat a lot of bugs." She stared at the darkening garden. "There's a whole field of corn out there. They'll strip it in an hour." "Maybe, but your garden's fenced, and your birds are mobile. You set the coops around the beds, ring the garden with them. Anything that tries to get through will have to go through the flock, and the flock'll eat them before they eat the beans." It was a wild idea. It was exactly the kind of idea that had made the neighbors laugh 2 years ago, but she had stopped caring about laughter. They spent the next 2 days moving every coop into a perimeter around the garden. There were 8 coops now, holding the full flock, spaced so that no gap was wider than a few feet. The birds seemed to sense the change. They were restless, scratching at the wire, watching the sky with their sidelong eyes. On Wednesday, the wind shifted to the south and brought a sound with it. A low humming, like a mill wheel turning far away. Martha stood in the lane and watched the horizon. The sky had a brownish tinge at the edge, and the humming grew louder. By Thursday morning, the first grasshoppers arrived. They came in a wave that darkened the sun. The air filled with them, a rattling cloud that blotted out the barn, the road, the fields beyond. Martha pulled her bandana over her mouth and ran to check the coops. The birds were in a frenzy, leaping at the wire, snatching grasshoppers through the mesh. The insects landed on the coops, on the garden, on her arms, and everywhere they landed, the birds ate them. All day the cloud passed overhead. The cornfield, unprotected, was stripped in hours. The stalks stood bare and broken, the ears gnawed down to the cob. The pasture went from green to brown as the grasshoppers settled and fed. But the garden ringed by 8 white coops and 178 hungry hens, the garden held. Every time a grasshopper landed on a bean leaf, a hen snatched it through the mesh. Every time they tried to crawl under the coops, the birds scratched them out and swallowed them. The flock ate all day, gorging themselves, and still the grasshoppers came. By evening the main cloud had passed, moving north. The air cleared. The humming faded. Martha stood in the middle of her garden, neck deep in green vines and heavy squash, and wept. The damage to the county was catastrophic. Every farm within 20 miles had lost its corn, most had lost their garden vegetables, and many had lost their pasture for the year. The Baines place, where Tully had built his own coops after Martha's design, had lost only a corner of their garden, the part not yet ringed by birds. Everywhere else, the story was the same. The conventional farmers had nothing left. Ezra Draper's fields were a wasteland. His corn, his beans, his hay, all gone. He stood at the edge of his property on Friday morning, looking at the bare stalks and the cracked earth, and he had nothing to say. His neighbors passed him on the road without stopping. The following Sunday, after church, Draper appeared at Martha's gate. He was hatless, his shirt collar frayed, and the look on his face was not anger, it was exhaustion. She came to the fence and waited. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "I saw your garden." "Yes." "It's still standing." "Yes." He looked at his boots for a long time. When he raised his eyes, they were wet. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I was wrong, and I said things that made folks doubt you. And now my fields are gone, and yours are green." She did not answer. She let him stand in the silence. "If there's any way," he said, "any way a man can learn what you did, I'd be obliged if you'd show me." She looked past him, at the bare fields of Draper's farm, at the neighbors' farms beyond his, all stripped and silent. She looked at the white coops around her garden, where the hens were scratching and clucking, turning the ground that had fed them, fed her, fed the whole county's hope. She opened the gate. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you." She opened the gate, and Ezra Draper stepped through like a man entering a church. He had never been on her land before, not once in all the years she had lived here, and he moved slowly, taking in the white coops, the green rows, the birds scratching in the afternoon light. His own fields lay bare behind him, stripped to stalks and dust, and the contrast was so sharp that he stopped halfway down the path and simply stood. Martha waited. She had learned to wait. "I don't understand it," he said finally. "I did everything right. I planted on time. I used good seed. I followed the methods my father taught me, and it's all gone, every bit of it." "The grasshoppers don't care about methods," she said. "They eat what's in front of them. But yours didn't." She led him to the nearest coop and lifted the hinged roof. The hens inside set up a low clucking, settling back to their scratching. The floor of the coop was clean straw over bare earth, and the earth beneath was dark and crumbled. "The birds don't stop the grasshoppers from coming," she said. "They eat them. A hen can eat 100 grasshoppers in a day, maybe more." When the swarm hit, my birds were eating faster than the grasshoppers could land. And the ground they've been working all season holds moisture. The plants are stronger. A strong plant can survive a few bites. A weak one can't. Draper knelt and ran his fingers through the soil. He brought a handful to his nose and smelled it, then let it fall. "I've been farming 30 years, he said. "I thought I knew what I was doing." "You knew what you were doing with the old way. This is a different way." He looked up at her, and the pride that had stiffened his spine for so long seemed to crack. "Will you teach me?" She had imagined this moment 100 times, the moment when Ezra Draper would come to her, hat in hand, and admit he was wrong. She had imagined the satisfaction she would feel, the quiet triumph. But standing there in the garden, with the sun going down and the birds settling for the night, the satisfaction did not come. What came instead was something simpler, the knowledge that he needed help, and she could give it. "I'll teach you," she said, "but not for free. You'll bring your own lumber and wire. You'll build your own coops. And you'll listen." "I'll listen," he said. He came the next morning with a wagon load of scrap lumber and a coil of wire. Martha showed him how to measure and cut, how to hinge the roof, how to set the wheels so the coop would roll true. He worked beside her in silence, his hands clumsy at first, learning the unfamiliar motions. Ellis watched from the barn shadow, saying nothing, but his eyes followed every move Draper made. It took a week to build the first coop. The second went faster. By the end of the month, Draper had 5 coops standing in his own yard, empty and waiting. He had bought 100 pullets from a hatchery in Topeka, not chicks but nearly grown birds, ready to work. He had spent money he could not afford, and for the first time in his life, he had done it without asking anyone's permission. The summer that followed was the hottest on record. The creeks dried up, the wells went low. The corn that had been replanted after the grasshoppers came up thin and yellow, and by August, most farmers in the county were hauling water from the river just to keep their stock alive. But on Draper's place, the garden began to green. It was not as lush as Martha's. He was still learning, still making mistakes, but it was green, and that was more than his neighbors could say. The change in him was slow and uneven. He still had the sharp tongue and the quick temper, and he still argued with Martha about the best way to do things. But he argued less as the weeks passed. He started to listen. He started to ask questions instead of giving answers. And one evening in September, when the first cool breeze came down from the north, he drove over to Martha's place with a basket of squash from his own garden. "They're not as big as yours," he said, "but they're mine." She took the basket and set it on the porch. "They'll get bigger. Give it time." He nodded and turned to go, then stopped. "Martha." "Yes?" "I never thanked you for letting me learn. I know I don't deserve it." She looked at the basket of squash, misshapen and small, and thought of all the years she had dug potatoes that were no larger than eggs. "You deserve it," she said. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn." He left without another word, and she stood on the porch and watched his wagon disappear down the lane. The sun was setting behind the barn, and the white coops caught the light and glowed. The autumn fair came around again. Martha entered her produce, more confident this time, but no less nervous, and took first place in potatoes, beans, and squash for the second year in a row. But this year there was something different. When her name was called, the crowd did not murmur with surprise. They applauded, they nodded, they had expected it. And Ezra Draper, standing at the back of the hall, applauded with them. The winter that year was mild, and by March the ground was soft enough to work. Martha expanded her operation. More coops, more birds, more beds. She had saved enough money to buy the adjoining 40 acres from the bank, the same bank that had once held her mortgage, and she hired a young man to help with the heavy work. His name was Samuel Bledsoe, Ruth's nephew, and he was eager and strong, and asked 100 questions a day. She taught him the way Ellis had taught her, slowly, patiently, letting the work speak for itself. She showed him how to read the soil, how to tell when a bed was ready for the birds and when it needed rest. She taught him to observe, to notice the way the swallows flew before rain, the way the hens gathered before a storm. She gave him the old ledger from her first year, the one with the cramped figures and the sketches of the first ugly coop. And she told him to keep his own records. "The ground will tell you what it needs," she said, "but only if you're quiet enough to listen." The summer of that year brought a new challenge. The rains came in April and May, steady and heavy, and by June the river had risen over its banks. The low fields flooded. The bottomland that had been planted in corn went under water for a week, and when the water receded, the corn was flat and rotting. The farmers who had followed Draper into the new methods, there were a dozen now, scattered across the county, fared better. Their worked soil drained faster. Their raised beds kept the roots above the worst of the water. They lost some, but not all. Martha's place sat on higher ground, and she lost nothing. But she watched the flood take the fields of those who had not yet learned, and she felt the old weight settle back onto her shoulders. The knowledge she had was not hers to keep. It was meant to be shared. She started holding meetings on Sunday afternoons. Farmers came from as far as 20 miles away, sitting on the porch and the steps in the grass, listening to her explain the rotation, the coops, the timing. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick. Ellis sat beside her and filled in the details she forgot. The questions came thick and earnest, and she answered every one. Ezra Draper came to the meetings too. He sat in the back, saying little, but he came. And when a young farmer asked whether the method would work on sandy soil, it was Draper who answered, describing his own struggles and how he had adapted. The other men listened. They trusted him now, in a way they had not before. And Martha, watching, felt something shift in her chest, a loosening, a release. By the third summer, the county had changed. The fields that had been pale and thin were darkening. The coops appeared on every road, painted white or red or left raw, rolling across gardens and small fields. The dry goods store now carried chicken wire in bulk. The hatchery in Lawrence had tripled its orders. The fair that year was a celebration, not a contest, because everyone who had followed the new method had something to show. Martha stood at her fence on a September evening and looked out over the valley. The sun was low, the light golden, and the fields below her were green and heavy with harvest. The white coops dotted the landscape like sheep, and the sound of hens carried on the breeze. Ellis came up beside her. He was older now, slower, leaning on a stick. His hearing had worsened, and he shouted even when he did not mean to. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she answered. He shook his head. "I just told you what I knew. You were the one who built it. You were the one who kept going when everyone laughed." She thought of the first coop, ugly and crooked, and the long nights alone in the kitchen with the ledger. She thought of the trampled hills and the whispering and the cold fear that had never quite left her. "I had help," she said. "I had you." "You had yourself," he said. "That's all you ever needed." The birds settled in their coops. The light faded. And somewhere down the road, a lantern glowed in Ezra Draper's window, a man who had once been her enemy, now learning to farm her way. But the next morning brought news that would test everything she had built. A letter arrived from the county surveyor's office, stamped and official, informing her that the railroad was planning a new line through the valley. The route, as drawn, would cut directly across her property, through the garden, through the coops, through the beds she had spent 3 years bringing back to life. And the railroad had the right of eminent domain. She read the letter twice, then set it on the table. The candle flame flickered. Outside, the hens began to call for their morning feed. She had fought Mockery. She had fought drought and flood and grasshoppers. She had fought Ezra Draper and won. But the railroad was a different kind of enemy, faceless, powerful, backed by law and money and the weight of progress. She did not know how to fight it. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. Then she went out to feed the birds, because the garden did not care about railroad surveyors. The garden only cared about the work. The letter sat on the table for 3 days before Martha showed it to anyone. She read it each morning with her coffee, then folded it and put it back in the drawer. The words did not change. The railroad line would cross her property at the southeast corner, cutting a diagonal swath through the lower garden, through the beds where the earliest coops had worked. The surveyors would arrive in August to mark the route. The land would be taken by eminent domain, and compensation would be determined by the county commission. Compensation. The word tasted wrong in her mouth. You could not compensate for 3 years of dead ground brought back to life. You could not compensate for the first time she had knelt in the dark soil and felt it give. You could not compensate for the blue ribbons, the porch meetings, the faces of the men who had come to learn. On the 4th day, she walked down to Ellis's place. He was sitting on his stoop, shelling peas into a tin bowl, and he saw her coming from a long way off. By the time she reached him, he had already set the bowl aside and was watching her face. "You've got trouble," he said. It was not a question. She handed him the letter. He read it slowly, moving his lips, then handed it back. "They can't take your land," he said. "They can. The law says they can. It's for the public good." Public good, he spat into the dirt. Public good don't look like tearing out a woman's garden to lay track for a railroad that'll carry wheat from Kansas City to Chicago. That's private profit wearing a public coat. She sat down on the stoop beside him. The peas were still in the bowl, bright green and wet. "I don't know what to do, Ellis." He was quiet for a long time. The sun moved across the yard, and the shadow of the barn crept toward them. "You go to town," he said. "You talk to a lawyer, and you find out what your rights are. The railroad has money and power, but they've got one weakness." "What's that?" "They're in a hurry. A hurry makes mistakes. You slow them down, you watch for the gaps, you find the thing they overlooked. That's how you fight a big thing with a small one." She went to Lawrence the next morning. The lawyer's office was above the dry goods store, a cramped room with a dusty window and a desk piled high with papers. The lawyer was a thin man named Percival Cook, with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. He listened to her story, read the letter, and nodded slowly. "The railroad has the right of eminent domain, Mrs. Crane. That's settled law. But they have to demonstrate that the route they've chosen is necessary, and that no reasonable alternative exists. If you can show that an alternative route would cause less disruption and cost no more, you might have a case." "How do I show that?" "You'll need a survey of your own. You'll need to document the value of what they're taking, not just the land, but the improvements, the coops, the soil work, the increased yield. You'll need witnesses who can testify that your methods are producing results that exceed ordinary farming." She left the office with a list of things to do and a thin thread of hope. But the thread was fragile, and the days were short. She spent July documenting everything. She measured every bed and recorded every crop. She took the ledger to the county clerk and had the yields notarized. She wrote letters to the fair judges asking for affidavits on the quality of her produce. Ezra Draper came forward without being asked. He wrote a statement describing what he had learned from her, how her methods had saved his farm, and offered to testify. The hearing was set for the first week of August. The railroad sent a representative from Topeka, a man named Hollister, with a smooth voice and a leather satchel. He spoke to the county commission for an hour, describing the economic benefits of the new line, the jobs it would create, the increase in land values along the route. He showed maps and surveys. He made it sound inevitable, like the advance of the seasons. Then it was Martha's turn. She stood at a wooden podium in the hot county meeting room, with the commission sitting before her and the railroad man watching from the side. She had her ledger, her affidavits, her maps drawn by hand. She spoke slowly, the way Ellis had taught her, letting each fact land. "This is not just land," she said. "This is soil I brought back from death. 3 years ago it was gray and hard and would not grow a weed. Now it grows the finest produce in the county. I have the ribbons to prove it. I have the witnesses to prove it. And I have 178 birds that are part of a system that has taught a dozen other farmers how to save their own ground." She held up her map. "The railroad's proposed route cuts through the heart of my garden. It destroys the beds I've built, the coops I've placed, the rotation I've established. There is an alternative route, a quarter-mile south, along the creek bed, that would avoid my property entirely and require no more grading than the current plan. I have a surveyor's estimate showing the cost difference is negligible." Hollister stood. "The alternative route would add 3 days to the construction timeline." 3 days, Martha repeated, "against a woman's livelihood, against a garden that feeds a dozen families, against a method that has turned this county's poorest soil into the richest." The commission deliberated for 2 hours. Martha sat on a bench in the hallway, staring at the wall, not praying because she had forgotten how. Ellis sat beside her, his hands folded, his eyes closed. When the commission filed back in, the chairman's face was unreadable. He cleared his throat. "We find that the railroad's proposed route is the most efficient for their purposes. The alternative route is rejected on the grounds of timeliness and cost. Mrs. Crane, you will be compensated for your land and improvements at fair market value. The surveyors will begin marking the route on Monday." The room went quiet. Martha heard the words, but they did not land. They floated in the air, disconnected from anything real. Ezra Draper stood up from the back row. "This is wrong," he said, his voice carried. "You're taking the best farm in this county to save 3 days of track laying, and you're calling it progress." The chairman tapped his gavel. "The decision is final, Mr. Draper." Martha walked out of the building into the August heat. The street was empty. The sun was white and high. She stood on the boardwalk with her ledger in her hands and felt the ground shift beneath her. Ellis came out behind her. "We're not done," he said. "They've decided, Ellis. They've decided today, but the surveyors don't come until Monday. That's 2 days. 2 days is a long time for a woman who knows how to work." She looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you got a garden that needs harvesting. I'm saying you got 178 birds that need moving. And I'm saying that between now and Monday, a lot can happen." She did not understand what he meant, But she saw the look in his eyes, the same look he had worn when he told her to buy the chicks, the same look he had worn when she stood up in the Agricultural Society meeting. It was the look of a man who had seen enough winters to know that the game was not over until the last card was played. She rode home in the wagon with the ledger beside her and the August dust rising in clouds. The garden came into view, green and full, the white coops standing in their rows. It was beautiful. It was hers. And in 2 days, the surveyors would come with their stakes and their chains, and the line would be drawn through the heart of it. She sat on the porch until dark. The birds settled. The stars came out. And somewhere in the night, she began to think. Monday dawned clear and hot. Martha was in the garden before the sun cleared the barn, not working, waiting. She had not slept. She had spent the night walking the beds, touching the soil, talking to the birds. She had made a decision. The surveyors arrived at 8 o'clock. There were 3 of them, a foreman and 2 rodmen, in canvas coats and wide hats. They carried a transit, a chain, and a bag of wooden stakes. They pulled up at the gate, and the foreman called out to her, "Mrs. Crane, we're here to mark the line." She walked to the gate and opened it. "I know." She did not argue. She did not block the way. She simply watched as they set up the transit and began to measure. The chain ran out across the lower garden, through the squash beds, through the potato hills. The foreman drove a stake into the ground at the edge of the first bed. He was about to drive the second when one of the rodmen called out, "Foreman, come look at this." The foreman walked over. The rodman was pointing at the ground, at the stake he had just driven. In the soft, worked soil around it, a hen was sitting on a nest of eggs, her feathers fluffed, her eyes fixed on the men with the unblinking stare of a creature protecting its own. "That's one of my layers," Martha said. "She's been sitting on that nest for 3 weeks. There's probably a dozen eggs under her, maybe more." The foreman looked at the hen, then at the stake, then at Martha. "We'll move her." "You can try," Martha said, "but she's broody. A broody hen doesn't move for anything. She'll peck your hand raw. And if you hurt her, I'll have the sheriff here before you drive another stake." The foreman sighed. He waved the rodman to the next stake location, 10 feet down the line. The rodman walked over, raised his hammer, and stopped. There was another hen, and another, and another. Every stake location was occupied by a broody hen, sitting tight on a nest, feathers fluffed, eyes fierce. Martha had spent the night moving them, carrying each hen and her eggs to the exact spots the surveyors would need to mark. 178 birds, placed with precision, turned the entire survey line into a minefield of feathers and fury. The foreman took off his hat and wiped his forehead. "Mrs. Crane, you can't do this." "I'm not doing anything," she said. "The hens are just sitting where they please. You're the ones driving stakes into their nests." The 2 rodmen looked at the foreman. The foreman looked at the line of hens stretching across the garden, each one a small, stubborn sentinel. He knew a losing battle when he saw one. "We'll come back tomorrow," he said. "They'll still be here tomorrow," Martha said. "And the day after, and the day after that. They're broody, and they'll stay broody until the eggs hatch. That's another 3 weeks, give or take." The foreman stared at her. She stared back. Behind her, Ellis came out of the barn, leading the mare by the halter. He did not say anything. He just stood in the lane and watched. The foreman packed up his transit. The rodmen pulled their stakes and followed him to the wagon. They drove off without another word. Martha watched them go. Then she walked back into the garden, knelt beside the nearest hen, and stroked her feathers. "Good girl," she whispered. Ellis came up beside her. "That'll hold them for a while, but they'll be back. The railroad's got lawyers. They'll get a court order if they have to." "I know. So what's your plan for when they come back?" She looked at the garden, at the birds, at the soil that had cost her everything to make. "I don't know yet," she said. "But I've got 3 weeks to think of something." The sun climbed higher, the garden warmed, and Martha Crane, who had once been laughed at for buying 180 baby chicks, sat in the dirt with a broody hen in her lap and the taste of a fight she had not yet won. The 3 weeks passed. The eggs hatched in slow waves, each broody hen emerging from her trance with a cluster of yellow chicks trailing behind her. The garden filled with the soft peeping of new life, and Martha walked the rows each morning counting the tiny birds that scattered like golden leaves before her feet. She had not planned for this. She had simply done what needed doing in the moment, and the moment had multiplied into 178 families. The surveyors did not return, but the letter did. It came by registered mail on a Tuesday, the envelope thick and official, bearing the seal of the district court. Martha opened it standing at the kitchen table, the chicks peeping in a box by the stove, and read the words that ended the waiting. The railroad had obtained a court order. The survey was to proceed on the following Monday, with the county sheriff present to enforce access. Any interference would be considered trespass and obstruction of a lawful order. She set the letter down and looked out the window at the garden. The coops stood in their rows, the hens scratched and dusted. The beds were heavy with the late summer harvest, beans hanging thick, squash gleaming, the potato tops beginning to yellow. It was the finest garden she had ever grown, and in 6 days it would be crossed by a line of stakes that would mark its end. She did not cry. The tears had dried up somewhere in the long fight. Instead, she sat down at the table with a stub of pencil and the old ledger and began to write. She wrote down everything she knew about the method, the construction of the coops, the rotation schedule, the timing of the moves, the feed ratios, the way to tell when a bed was ready. She wrote until her hand cramped, then shook it out and wrote more. The words filled page after page, a testament to 3 years of work, a record that could not be taken by any court. On Wednesday, she drove to Lawrence and had the ledger copied at the printer's shop. She paid for 2 copies and sent one to the Agricultural College in Manhattan by post. She kept the other in the kitchen drawer, next to the empty banknote envelope. On Thursday, the neighbors began to arrive. They came in wagons and on foot, from the farms she had helped, from the Sunday meetings, from the county fair where her name was now spoken with respect. They came to stand with her, or to say goodbye, or simply to look at the garden one last time. Ezra Draper came with his wife and stood at the fence without speaking. Tully Baines came with a pitchfork over his shoulder and asked if she needed someone to watch the lane. Ruth Bledsoe brought a basket of preserves and pressed Martha's hand. On Friday, the county commissioner who had voted against her appeared at the gate. He was a small man named Hargrove, with a red face and a nervous habit of clearing his throat. He did not come to apologize. He came to tell her that the commission had received a petition, signed by more than 100 residents of Douglas County, requesting that the alternative route be reconsidered. The railroad hasn't agreed, he said, but they've agreed to hear the petition. There's a meeting set for Monday morning before the surveyors go out. Martha looked at him. Monday morning is the same day they plan to start. Yes, it's a narrow window. Then I'll be there. She spent the weekend doing nothing but walking the garden. She touched every plant, every leaf, every potato hill. She sat in the sun with the hens and let the chicks climb over her boots. She did not think about the meeting. She did not think about the court order. She thought about the ground, the way it had been dead and gray, the way it had come back under her hands, the way it held now and gave and would keep giving as long as someone tended it. On Monday morning, she rose before dawn. She put on her best dress, the one with the mended collar, and pinned the 3 blue ribbons across her chest. She did not know if it was pride or foolishness, but she wanted them to see what they were taking. The meeting was held in the same county room where the first decision had been made. The commission sat at the same long table, and the room was full, standing room only, with men and women pressed against the walls. Ezra Draper was there, Ruth Bledsoe, Tully Baines, Orrin Hiller, the Baines wife, a dozen farmers she had taught, their wives, their children. And in the front row, alone, sat the railroad man, Hollister, his leather satchel on his lap. The chairman called the meeting to order. He recognized the petition, acknowledged the large number of signatories, and then called on the railroad to respond. Hollister stood. He was smooth and practiced. This petition is noted. However, the route has been approved by the county commission. The court order stands. We are prepared to begin surveying today. Delay costs money, and the railroad cannot be expected to bear the cost of reconsideration every time a landowner objects. He sat down. The room murmured. The chairman turned to the petitioners. "Is there anyone who wishes to speak on behalf of the alternative route?" Ezra Draper stood up. He walked to the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. He was not the same man who had laughed at Martha's first coup. His hands were rough now, calloused from building his own coups, his face lined from working in the sun. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I'm Ezra Draper. Some of you know me. Some of you know what I used to think of Martha Crane and her chickens. I laughed at her. I spread whispers about her. I tried to keep her out of the fair." He paused. "I was wrong." The room was silent. "I was wrong about her, and I was wrong about the land. She took a piece of ground that was dead and made it live again. She did it with nothing but 180 chicks and the grit to see it through. And then she taught me. She taught me when I had done nothing to deserve it. She taught me when I had been her enemy." He looked at Martha. "I owe that woman everything, and I am not the only one." Tully Baines stood. "She gave me my first coup. I'd have lost my farm without it." Ruth Bledsoe stood. "She taught my nephew Samuel. He's farming his own place now because of her." One by one they stood. The farmers she had taught, the wives who had learned from her Sunday meetings, the children who had grown up watching the white coops roll across the fields. They told their stories, short and plain, and the room grew warmer with each telling. When the last one sat down, the chairman looked at Hollister. "Do you have any response?" Hollister was silent. He had come prepared to argue against one woman. He had not come prepared to argue against the entire county. The chairman turned to the commission. They conferred in low voices. The room waited. The chairman stood. "The commission has voted to reconsider the route. We will conduct a full review, including a survey of the alternative, and we will stay enforcement of the court order pending the outcome. Survey work on Mrs. Crane's property is suspended until further notice." The room erupted. Men clapped. Women cried out. Ruth Bledsoe grabbed Martha's arm and held it tight. But Martha did not hear the noise. She was looking at Ezra Draper, who had not sat down. He was still standing at the front of the room, and his eyes were wet. He walked over to her, and the crowd parted. "Martha," he said, "I never said it plain, and I should have. You taught me. You saved me, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be as good as you are." She could not speak. She nodded, and he nodded back, and then he turned and walked out of the room, and the crowd followed him, and Martha stood alone in the empty room with the 3 blue ribbons on her dress and the sound of the people cheering outside. The review took 2 weeks. The surveyor who had originally marked the route was sent back to measure the alternative. The railroad balked, but the commission held firm, and the public support for Martha's farm was too loud to ignore. In the end, the alternative route was approved. The line ran along the creek, a quarter-mile south of her property, through ground that was already broken and thin. The railroad saved their 3 days. Martha saved her garden. The day the news came, she walked out into the garden alone. The sun was low, the light golden, the coops white against the green. The hens were settling, and the chicks were tucked under their mother's wings. She knelt at the edge of the first bed, where the first ugly coop had worked its way across the dead gray soil 3 years before. The soil now was dark and crumbled and alive. She reached into the dirt and brought up a potato. It was small, not much larger than an egg, the kind she would have counted a failure in the old days. But it was hers. It had grown in ground she had made. She held it in her palm, warm and solid, and she understood that the fight had never been about the railroad. It had been about the ground, and the ground had won. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. The sun was setting behind the barn, and the white coops caught the light and glowed. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.